Shalom. This is Rabbi Abraham Fisher again, talking to you about Parsha highlights and insights. Hope you're all doing well. I'm very happy now to be speaking to you about this week's Parsha, because with this week's Parsha, we resume the reading of the Torah from the beginning. We go back to the beginning of Bereishit. On Simchat Torah, the holiday which we just celebrated, we got a foretaste of the beginning of the Torah, because the common practice, the minhag, is to complete the reading of the Torah on Simchat Torah and then to start all over again from the beginning with the very, very beginning of the reading of the Torah, in order to show this idea that the learning of Torah continues. We don't say that we're finished with something. Even if we come to the end, we go back to the beginning and start again, because we can always find more and more to discover. The study of Torah itself is ongoing. It is eternal. And so we begin with the beginning of the Torah, with Bereishit. Let's take a look at some of the major ideas in this first part of the Torah, Bereishit. So, of course, not surprisingly, it begins with creation. And we talked about this in preparation for Simchat Torah. The first section of the Torah talks about the 6 days of creation and what happened on each one of those days, each one of those periods of time. On the first day of creation, God created light and separated the light from the darkness and gave names to the situation of light, called it Yom, day, and called the time when it is dark, he called that Laila, night. And then the second day of creation, in which God creates a firmament, a rakia, something to separate the waters that are above from the waters that are below. So there seems to be water as part of the totality of creation. On the third day of creation, God creates the seas and the dry land. He separates between the area where there is water and has the dry land exposed. And he gives names to the seas, calls them yamim, seas, and the dry land, which is yabasha, dry land. And from the dry land, God commands that vegetation should come forth. And here we have a whole discussion about different kinds of vegetation, grasses and trees and grains, fruits and vegetables, which come into being as God commands them. This is the third day of creation. The fourth day of creation is next. And on the fourth day of creation, God creates the luminaries, those lights that are in the sky, which are meant to be used in order to regulate time. And we know the sun, the moon, and the stars. It's interesting that the Torah talked about light, God creating light on the first day of creation, and it's not until the fourth day of creation that we have things in the sky that that contain or give off light, and that seems to be because the light of the first day of creation, or the first 3 days, is a different kind of light, which pervades the entire universe. Now, there is a special kind of a light that is concentrated in these luminaries, in these heavenly bodies. Our rabbis teach us that the light of the first day of creation is a light that God put away for the benefit of the tzaddikim, of the righteous. So the fourth day of creation, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Then we come to the fifth day of creation. And on the fifth day of creation, we begin to talk about life, life that's different from vegetation. Uh, First, marine life, things that live in the water, all different types of life forms that live in the water, from the small to the large, sea creatures of various types. And God also creates birds or other creatures that are capable of flight. Those that live. So on the fifth day, we have those things that live in the water and those things that live in the air. On the sixth day of creation, we have higher forms of life, those forms of life that live on land. First, animals, all different types of animals, uh, wild beasts and domesticable beasts and so on. And God decides to create man. Uh, and a few things about the nature of man and the purpose that man is going to have in this world that God has created. One is that man is to be in God's image. This is a cornerstone of our thinking, that human beings are created in the image of God, and that means, among other things, that all human beings contain something that is godly in them, and therefore they have to treat each other and themselves with this in mind, that every human being contains as it were, a part of God. Man is also given his task within this world, and that is he is to be the one to rule over all of the other living creatures. He is going to keep order. He is going to decide how these creatures are going to be used, presumably for his benefit. Man is also told that he is to eat vegetation only. Man at this point is vegetarian, is only permitted to eat vegetation. At least that's one way of reading these texts. And at this point, God decides that he has created all that he wants to create. By the way, when they say that God creates man, it doesn't just mean male. At this point, the Torah says that God creates both male and female. More details about that are coming up in the next section. So all that God has made is good. God looks at the entirety of the creation that he's made and determines and declares that it is good. So all of creation leads up to the creation of the human being. And then comes the seventh day of creation. On this seventh day, God decides to abstain from any further creation. God decides that he is not going to create anything more. From this point on, any further development that's going to happen in this world is going to come from the raw materials that God has provided and through the, shall we say, creativity of man. And God blesses and sanctifies this day. And because it's a day that he refrains, he abstains from further creation, and the word for that is Shabbat, to refrain, to abstain. So this day is called Shabbat. And it is noteworthy that of all of the days of the week, it's only Shabbat that is given a name. All of the other days of the week, even until today in Hebrew, are just called by number, first day, second day, and so on. Only Shabbat is given a name of its own. Now that we have reached this point, the Torah wants to focus its attention on exactly how this first human was created. And so the Torah returns to this and talks about it in greater detail, and we'll find out why this human is called Adam. It says that God created this creature, this living creature, from the dust of the earth. And earth, soil, is Adama. And the man, this living creature, or this soon-to-be living creature, is called Adam because it's created from Adama. But the dust of the earth is not living, and so God breathes into this formed but not yet living entity a soul. God breathes into it the breath of life. And so this is a further examination of how man is in the image of God, because man has within him the breath that God has breathed into him. It is, as it were, a piece of God. The Torah says that God prepares a place for Adam to live. In a place called Eden, he creates a garden. And it's a garden because it has every possible type of plant life, including the plant life that man will eat, fruits and vegetables and grains and the like. Torah also describes the 4 rivers that go through Eden, and although it's possible that the courses of these rivers have changed since that time, especially after the flood that we'll learn about in next week's Parsha, Noach, but those rivers are identified and they map out really the center of the ancient world that goes from middle of Africa to Iraq. So there are 4 rivers, and God places man in Eden, and here man is given an additional an additional task, additional purpose. Earlier we talked about how man's purpose is to rule over creation. Now, a different type of task, and that is man is placed in Eden in order to work it, to develop it, and also to preserve it, to develop it, but not to exploit it to the point that it would be destroyed. And it's at this point that God gives man his first commandment. That is, that all of the fruits and vegetables and grains that are available in the garden, he may eat. However, there is a particular fruit of a particular tree that he is not to eat, and that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the fruit of that tree is forbidden to him. He is not permitted to eat that fruit. God determines that man needs a companion. Lo tov heyota adam levado. Man being alone is not good. It's not a good situation. It's not productive. It's not proper. And so the God determines that man needs to have a companion. Now remember, in the first chapter, we were told that man was created male and female. But now the Torah is, as I said, focusing on exactly how that happened. So first man was created, and man needs to have a companion. In the first phase of looking for a companion, God makes it possible for man to name all of the living creatures. Perhaps that type of dominance will give him a sense of companionship. But in all of the creatures of the world, man is not able to find a true companion, someone who is sufficiently like him, ezer kenegdo, a help that is proper, suitable for him. And so God goes about creating woman. He does so by putting Adam into a deep sleep, taking out part of his side and building it, developing it into a woman. And she will be his companion, and the man recognizes that this is the proper companion because she is just like me, she comes from me, and that will be the proper companionship. And it's at this point, of course, that the Torah declares that this is the reason why, as a person develops, it is proper at a certain point for him to leave his parents and form a union with his wife, and they create that companionship, the beginnings of the family, and of course, future children. So this is how Adam and the first woman were created. The word for man or for male is ish, and the woman is called isha, which essentially means from ish, made from man. The next section talks about the sin, which brought about ultimately the expulsion of the man and woman from the Garden of Eden. This is the sin of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The snake incites the woman to transgress. He asks her about this, about what she is permitted to do, and she says she's not permitted to eat or even to touch the tree. And the snake persuades her that that the reason why God doesn't want them to eat this fruit is because it will change their consciousness and will make them on the same level as God, and God's trying to protect His power, as it were. And the woman makes a decision that the fruit seems appropriate, tasty, that it has great power, and so she transgresses. She eats. She gives the man to eat as well. And once they eat, they have a different way of looking at things. They realize that they were created naked, but up until this point, they had no shame in their nakedness. But now that they have transgressed, they have a sense of their own shame. And so, because they have this shame, they make coverings for themselves, kind of belts made out of fig leaves. When God approaches them, God at first gives man the opportunity to admit that he has sinned. Where are you? Why aren't you out in the open? And the man says, "Well, I'm naked." And God says to him, "Who told you you were naked? Where did you get that awareness from? Is it possible that this is the result of you eating of the fruit?" So he's giving him an opportunity to admit his sin, because human beings have the capacity for sin. And what's important, what God wants, is that when they sin, they try to make amends. And the first step in that, of course, is admitting that they're wrong. Adam, instead of taking responsibility for his own sin, blames the woman, and then the woman blames the snake. Uh, and so all three of them need to be punished. And it's at this point that God talks about the punishment that they're going to have. The punishment of the snake is that it will crawl on its belly. Apparently, up until this point, it could walk, but at this point, it lives just crawling on its belly. It will eat dust, and it will be the enemy of mankind. Human beings will find them repulsive and will try to kill them. So snake is punished in that way. The punishment that the woman will have is that she will suffer in childbirth, yet she will have a desire for her husband, but she will suffer through childbirth. Adam is punished. That even though he is supposed to work the land will be unproductive. The earth itself will be cursed, and even though he works very hard, there's no guarantee that the land will produce what he wants, what he's planted, what he expects to come out. So all of Adam's life will be a life of toil. It's from here that we have the famous expression, by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. You're going to have to work very, very hard. And there will always be the anxiety, maybe all the work I'm doing will not bring results. And uh, it's made very clear that they are mortal, that they are going to die. Not immediately, but they are going to die. Um, right after God spells out the punishment, um, the woman is given a name. The man is called Adam, as we said, because he's made from Adamah, is made from the earth, and man gives the woman a name, and he calls her Chava, which comes from the word Chai, life, because she is the mother of all living things. She is the one who's going to bring life into the world. Even though they have been punished, but Hashem is sensitive to their feelings of shame and nakedness, and so he provides Adam and Chava with clothing that seem to be made out of leather, and then he expels them from Eden and places fiery angels at the entrance to Eden, so that no one will return there who does not belong there. And then we learn about, in the next section, about the first children that Adam and Chava have, Cain and Hevel. We're told about the birth of Cain and Hevel. The name Cain comes from the word that means to acquire or to create. Chava recognizes the fact that in giving birth to a child, and Cain is her first, she has an ability with God's help that is similar to God, namely to bring life into the world. Hevel's name is not explained. The basis of the name is not explained, but Hevel means a breath, that which is fleeting. And the truth is that his life is very fleeting. Each one of them, Cain and Hevel, choose a different occupation. And these are the two main occupations that we find in ancient times. The two major occupations, the majority of people are one of two types. Hevel is a shepherd. He cares for animals, and Cain is a farmer. He works the earth. So those are their occupations. At a certain point, they decide to bring offerings from their occupations. So Cain brings from the fruit of the land as an offering to God, whereas Hevel brings from the best of his flock, the best of his flock. So it seems that Hevel is choosing the best for God, whereas Cain is not choosing the best for God, and that explains the way that God reacts to their offerings. God accepts the offering of Hevel because he brings the best to God, whereas God does not accept the offering brought by Cain, and God even gives Cain some instruction. He says, "You're capable of doing better." Um, he gives him what we would call musar, an admonition, but it's measured. He hasn't exactly sinned. He just has fallen short, and this should be a kind of a wake-up call for Cain to do better next time. But Cain doesn't go in that direction. He remains jealous of Hevel, it would seem, and for this reason and others, Cain uh, kills Hevel. Cain becomes angry, and he kills Hevel. And it's at this point that God judges Cain, saying that he is to be a wanderer through the earth. Uh, Cain this time admits that he has done something terribly wrong, and he is worried that wherever he wanders, if he is a person without a place, without a state, that anyone will kill him without paying, without caring, because there's no one to stand up for him, and that's why God promises that his that no one will be allowed to kill Cain. Um, Cain is to be exiled. That is his punishment, and no one will be permitted to kill him. And then Cain begins to wander the earth. Um, so we learn next about the generations that descend from Cain. He has a child, Hanoch. By the way, it should be pointed out that the Torah doesn't tell us the names of all of the children of uh, of Adam and Eve, of Adam and Chava. It does say that they had other children, and it would seem that certainly in the earliest generations, these children married amongst themselves. Um, and so there's no surprise um, that Cain had a wife. And with that wife, he had a child named Hanoch. And the Torah says that Cain even built a city and named it after his son, Hanoch. And then we have the succeeding generations after Cain and Hanoch: Irad, Mechuyael, Metushael, and then Lemech, a few generations. There's a little bit of a story about Lemech. It says that he has two wives, one named Ada and the other one named Tzila. And it even tells us about the children that they had. Ada had a son named Yaval, who was the father of shepherds. Now, there were shepherds before, but he becomes the person who perfects the the skill the skills that are involved in taking care of animals and shepherding. And his brother Yuval is one who develops musical instruments and plays them. Tzila has two children, one son named Tuval Cain, who makes metal implements, and also a sister to Tuval Cain, whose name is Naamah. Rashi, by the way, says, quoting the Midrash, that Naamah marries Noach later on. And to complete the story of Lemech here, Lemech says a little, can't call it a prophecy, but it's a kind of a poem in which he admits that he has killed and that he will be punished for it. The Midrash says that he's actually the one who uh, accidentally, unintentionally killed Cain, and therefore he is to be punished for it. The Torah then goes back and tells us about what happened to Adam and Chava after the death of Hevel. They have other children. In particular, the Torah talks about Shet, that God has given them a child after the death of Hevel, and the child of Shet is Enosh. The Torah talks about that it's at this time in human history that the people begin to develop what we might call spiritual strivings, wanting to understand how God works in the world and how they are to relate to God. But rabbis teach us that from those spiritual strivings, a number of errors arose, including the error of idolatry. Very briefly put, mankind began to think that the various entities that exist, the planets, the angels, all of the various forces of nature, um, should be approached as an intermediary between themselves and God, that it is not proper to talk to God directly, and rather to talk to pray to sacrifice to these intermediaries who would then bring the message, as it were, to God. But that is a mistake that ultimately led to deifying these entities, the planets and the stars and animals and the like. So this notion of an intermediary is really the beginning of idolatry, and it happened during this time. And then in the next section, the very last part of Parashat Bereishit, the Torah traces the generations from Adam to Noah. And in each case, the Torah tells us how old each one was when the next generation was born, that they had other children without naming those other children, and the total lifespan of each. So after Adam, we have Shet, and then Enosh, and then Kenan, and then Mahalalel, and then Yered, and then Chanoch. And about Chanoch, the Torah says that God takes him early because the generation was too sinful, and he was a righteous person, but he may not have been strong enough to withstand those temptations. And then Mitushelach, and the next generation is Lemech, not to be confused. This is the second person named Lemech, a different person. This is Lemech, who is a descendant of Shet, as distinguished from the other Lemech, who is a descendant of Cain. And Lemech has a son named Noach, and Noach has three sons named Shem, Cham, and Yefet. And the Torah talks about how mankind has become very sinful. It seems that there was sinfulness in morality, in all forms, in all areas of morality, and God decides to destroy mankind, and with mankind all living things, because if there's no purpose for mankind to exist, then there's no purpose for the other living things to exist. However, the Torah concludes this parasha, Noach finds favor in Hashem's eyes, which means that perhaps there is a future for humankind, but by focusing on Noach and his descendants exclusively. And of course, that will bring us to next week's parasha, the story of Noach. The first verses in the Torah are the subject of volumes of discussion. We're going to look at one aspect of those opening verses in Rashi and in a comment to explain Rashi. Bereishit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. There are different ways of translating this. This translation follows Rashi, which says, when God began to create heaven and earth, and then we have a parenthetical remark, namely that the earth was, at the beginning, unformed, void, darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. God said, so the first thing that God said in the act of creation was, let there be light, and there was light. As I said, there's so many things that can be discussed about this, but here is the very first comment of Rashi on the Torah. He says, he quotes a midrash, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, that the Torah did not need to start with creation. Um, Really, it should have started uh, 12 chapters into the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, because that's where we have the very first mitzvah, the first commandment of God to Israel. So, what is the reason that the Torah starts with creation? Why does the Torah give us the details of how the world was created, and along those lines, not only how the world was created, but the entire book of Bereishit, the story from the creation through Noah, through the Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, uh, Yosef and his brothers, and then the descent to Egypt, the exile in Egypt, and then the first mitzvah. It says that the Torah really needed to start from the first mitzvah. This month shall be for you the first of the months. So the Midrash that Rashi quotes says the reason is because of an idea that we find in the book of Tehillim. He declared to his people the strength of his works in order that he might give them the heritage of the nations. He understands this first to mean that the reason why the Torah starts off by telling us about creation is um, it's possible that at some time in the future, the people of the world will say that that the Jewish people, that Israel, have stolen the land of Israel from the previous inhabitants because you took it by force, the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan. Okay, so the connection of the two verses is God told us about his creation in order to give them give Israel the heritage of the nations, meaning the land of Israel. So if the nations of the world ever accuse Israel of being robbers, then Israel can respond, all the earth belongs to God. He created it and gave it to whom it was right in his eyes. God decided who should have the land of Israel. So by his will, he gave it to them, first to the 7 nations of Canaan, and by his will, he took it from them and gave it to us. Okay, so according to Rashi, the reason for starting the Torah uh, with creation is in order to explain why the land of Israel could be given to the Jewish people, to Israel, and that they're not robbers. There are a lot of questions that can be asked about this, but at first we're struck by the boldness of Rashi's first observation, the suggestion that the whole first part of the Torah is unnecessary, or it seems that way. Does Rashi actually mean that Bereishit is unnecessary? I mean, after all, the history of the beginning of humanity is important, and the concept that God created the world is a cornerstone of our belief. On the basis of the idea that God created the world, we say that God is the creator and therefore controls all of the forces of nature, and therefore miracles are possible, and so on. And because God is the creator, we are morally bound to obey him. So creation is a very important fundamental of Judaism. Does Rashi not consider that important? So one of the commentaries on Rashi, called Gur Aryeh, written by the Maharal of Prague, uh, explains that Rashi doesn't mean to suggest that the book of Bereishit should not have been written. Of course it should have been written. It's absolutely necessary. We do need to learn about creation. We need to know about our ancestors. We need to know about the role models of the patriarchs and the matriarchs and the mistakes that earlier generations made so that we can learn from them. All of that is absolutely indispensable. The Rashi's question, according to the Maharal, is not why is Bereishit written at all, but why is it included in the Torah? The Torah, it is assumed, is primarily a book of mitzvot. And the first mitzvah that's given to all of Israel is the mitzvah that Rashi mentioned, the mitzvah of giving of starting the year in the same month as Nisan and how to create the calendar and so on. It's true, by the way, that there are 3 mitzvot in the book of Bereishit, but they could have been incorporated theoretically anywhere else. So the question is, why include Bereishit in the Torah, in the book of mitzvot? Now, if that's the question, then how is Rashi answering his question? Because instead of discussing the mitzvot, he talks about how creating the world justifies Hashem awarding the land of Israel to the Jewish people. So how does that answer the question? So here is where the Maharal explains this. How does the issue of giving the land connected to the Torah's mitzvot? Most of the Torah's mitzvot are performed in conjunction with the Jewish people's sovereignty or dwelling in the land. First of all, he starts off with mitzvot that can only be performed in the land of Israel. Trumot, Masrot, and so on. The building of the temple can only take place in the land of Israel. And so all of the mitzvot that have to do with the Beit HaMikdash and the sacrifices and so on must be done in the land. So these mitzvot cannot be done at all. So what Rashi is saying is, yes, the Torah is a book of mitzvot, and the performance of mitzvot is very much connected to the land of Israel. But we have to go further than this. First, as the Maharal says, the majority of mitzvot depend directly on the land of Israel. Not only those mitzvot that can only be done in Israel, but also those that are connected to the temple. But more than that is an idea that we find in the Ramban, that the main place where the mitzvot are meant to be kept, all of the mitzvot are meant to be kept, is in the land of Israel. And that's not only true of those mitzvot that are connected to the land of Israel, but ideally even mitzvot that are not necessarily connected with the land of Israel. So all mitzvot of the Torah are primarily relevant, or most relevant, in the land of Israel. To quote Rav Kook, who says that it's only in the Holy Land can the spirit of our people develop and become a light for the world. And so it's important for Rashi to point out that, yes, the Torah is a book of mitzvot, and mitzvot are directly connected on so many levels to the Jewish people living in the land of Israel, and the account of the creation shows that God is the one who decides who is to live in the land. And as we follow the stories in the book of Bereishit, we find that the rest of humanity doesn't deserve the land of Israel, but instead the land of Israel is given to the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But that's for later Torah portions. There's no guarantee that the other nations of the world will take this idea to heart, that the land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. But at the very, very least, we, the Jewish people, should internalize that idea, and we must be secure in our commitment to the idea that the Jewish people have a legitimate right to the land of Israel, because that is the beginning of the Torah. I thank you all for listening. Look forward to speaking to you again next time. Let me wish all of you well, and look forward to speaking to you next time. More Parsha highlights and insights. This is Rabbi Avraham Fisher saying Shalom.